something pretty significant seems to be shifting in how America approaches crime. It's sparking this really heated debate about, how our cities are governed, how they're kept safe.
That's right. And just recently, there was that shocking carjacking incident near Logan Circle in Washington, D.C.
Right.
And that immediately brought threats of federal intervention right to the Capitol. It really ignited a whole national conversation.
Yeah, President Trump responded very quickly, didn't he? Calling for, a federal takeover of D.C.'s police, tougher measures.
Mm-hmm. And trying young offenders as adults. He's been arguing that crime is, quote, out of control, even saying D.C. is one of the most dangerous cities anywhere in the world.
And this is where it gets interesting. The official data from the D.C. police, it paints a completely different picture.
A starkly different one.
It shows violent crime rates have actually fallen, like historic lows. Lowest in over 30 years in 2024, and apparently still dropping this year, 2025. So it creates this real puzzle.
It absolutely does. Yeah. And it makes you ask, are American cities genuinely facing this uncontrolled crime wave that needs Washington stepping in?
Or is it more about political narratives, public perception maybe, driving these really dramatic policy shifts, even when the numbers are saying something else entirely?
That's the core question.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place where we unpack these complex topics, try to cut through the noise so you can understand what's really going on, and importantly, why it matters.
And today, we're diving deep into exactly that. The shifting landscape of crime in American cities. We'll focus a lot on Washington, D.C. as a kind of case study.
Yeah, examining this tension between perception, political responses, and the actual data. Our mission, as always, is to pull out the key insights from the sources we've looked at so you can quickly get a handle on the real dynamics.
Let's start with this turnaround. It's pretty dramatic.
It really is. Cast your mind back just a few years to 2020.
Right, after the murder of George Floyd.
Exactly. There was a huge national movement, efforts to curb police powers, even talk about scaling back law enforcement budgets in lots of cities.
Yeah.
Especially, the big Democrat-led ones.
The focus then was very much on reform, maybe looking at root causes.
And now, it feels like a complete 180. These same big blue cities, you hear that term a lot, San Francisco, D.C., New York City. They're embracing what people are calling tough on crime policies again.
It's a really stark reversal, a genuine retreat, you could say, for some progressives from those earlier efforts, almost an ideological whiplash.
So what's behind that? Why such a quick pivot? Is it actual crime waves?
Well, that's the critical point, isn't it? Yeah. So much of this seems driven less by a nationwide surge in actual crime statistics.
Okay.
And more by the perception of crime increasing, and maybe the type of crime.
You mean like the very visible stuff?
Exactly. You see it in the public anger over, say, brazen carjackings or those organized retail thefts you see on the news.
Yeah, those get a lot of attention.
They really do. And even if national crime rates overall have mostly ticked down after those post-pandemic spikes, those visible, sometimes shocking crimes, they really resonate with people. They stick in the mind.
And it's not just general public frustration driving this, is it? There's definitely a political angle, too.
Oh, absolutely. Politics plays a huge role. Republicans have consistently, hammered Democrats, portraying them as weak on law enforcement.
That creates pressure.
Immense pressure. Look at Governor Kathy Hochul in New York. Her 2022 election was much tighter than expected.
Right, I remember that.
And since then, she's very publicly backed away from some earlier bail reform laws that critics called too lenient. That's a direct response to that pressure.
And it's coming from the ground up, too, not just other politicians.
Yes, definitely. We're seeing voter frustration directly leading to policy changes. San Francisco is a prime example.
The DA recall.
Exactly. Voters recalled their progressive district attorney, Chesa Boudin, back in 2022. And right now in D.C., 2 city council members, Charles Allen and Brianne Nadeau, are actually facing recall campaigns.
Why them specifically?
Well, the recall efforts are fueled by public anger over their perceived support for more liberal crime policies in the past. It really shows how local sentiment can, force the hand of policymakers.
So, okay, if that's the backdrop, the perception, the political pressure, the voter frustration, what do these tough-on-crime measures actually look like in practice? Let's take San Francisco again.
Well, in March 2024, voters there approved measures for drug screenings for welfare recipients. They also lifted some restrictions on police operations, like vehicle pursuits and surveillance tech.
And the mayor there, London Breed, she's pushing for more.
She is, along with San Jose Mayor Matt Mahan. They're backing a statewide referendum to increase penalties for certain drug and property crimes.
Which would roll back earlier reforms, right?
Yes, specifically Proposition 47 from 2014, which had reduced penalties for those offenses. So it's a clear move back in the other direction.
What about D.C.? You mentioned the council members facing recalls, but what has the council actually done?
Even D.C.'s Progressive City Council passed a pretty comprehensive crime package in March 2024.
Okay, what's in it?
Well, it includes measures designed to keep more people in jail while they're awaiting trial. It toughens penalties for certain offenses like gun crimes, and it expands some police powers.
And who is pushing for that within the council?
Councilmember Brooke Pinto was a major champion. She explicitly said there was a need for the government to lean in and do more, to provide for the safety and well-being of our residents. So this wasn't a federal thing. This was the local council responding.
Responding to that local pressure we talked about.
Precisely. And then you look at New York City.
The National Guard in the subway?
Yeah, Governor Hochul ordered hundreds of National Guard troops into the subway system back in March 2024. That was in response to some high-profile transit attacks.
And they increased police presence, too.
Yes, more state police, more MTA police. And Mayor Eric Adams himself, a former NYPD captain, he's also flooded stations with officers trying to boost arrests.
He actually said something interesting about that, didn't he? About perception versus stats?
He did. He acknowledged that sometimes these actions are about changing perceptions about crime that do not always align with the statistics.
So it's almost like an admission. We know the stats say one thing, but people feel unsafe, so we act on the feeling.
It's a really difficult balancing act for officials. And like we said, nowhere is that tension, that gap between rhetoric and data, clearer right now than in Washington, D.C.
Okay, let's dig into that D.C. case study. You mentioned the Edward Korestein incident earlier, August 3rd, 2025.
Right, that attempted carjacking near Logan Circle.
Right.
Korestein, he's 19, former employee in the Trump administration's Department of Government Efficiency.
COGE, yeah.
Right, he was apparently severely assaulted while defending a female companion. Two 15-year-olds from Maryland were arrested. Others are still being sought. There's a reward out.
And this specific incident, it just blew up nationally.
It really became a flashpoint. Almost immediately, President Trump was making these very strong calls for minors involved in violent crimes like this to be tried as adults, even suggesting as young as 14.
Highlighting the severity and the youth aspect.
Exactly. And then came the threats about D.C. itself.
The federal takeover threats.
Yes, repeated threats of a federal takeover if local authorities didn't, quote, get its act together. Talk of taking over the MPD, the D.C. Police Department, or deploying the National Guard more broadly.
And using that line about D.C. being one of the most dangerous cities anywhere in the world, that's powerful language.
Very powerful. It definitely grabs headlines. Now, legally, it's important to be clear here.
Okay.
While the president does command the D.C. National Guard directly, unlike in states...
Right, because D.C. isn't a state.
Exactly. But a full federal takeover of the city government, taking back control from the elected mayor and council, that would require an act of Congress to repeal the Home Rule Act of 1973.
So it's not something a president can just order.
No, it's a huge legislative lift. It would basically undo D.C.'s self-governance, turn it back into essentially a federal territory managed by Congress. That's a massive step with deep historical roots and, frankly, unlikely to get easy bipartisan support.
Got it. But he did take some action through executive order.
Yes. In March 2025, that executive order, making the District of Columbia safe and beautiful.
Right. What did that entail?
It mandated a range of punitive enforcement and federal oversight measures. Things like cracking down on quality of life, crimes loitering, that sort of thing, maximizing deportations, easing gun restrictions within D.C., interestingly, increasing pretrial detention, so keeping more people locked up before trial, and removing homeless encampments, but notably without directives for providing alternative housing. It's a very clear get tough policy package.
Okay, so that's the rhetoric, the political pressure, the executive actions. But then there's the data. Let's circle back to those D.C. crime stats.
This is where the contrast is just so stark. The official data directly contradicts the out-of-control narrative.
What do the numbers actually show?
Violent crime in D.C. fell dramatically by 35% between 2023 and 2024. That brought it to its lowest rate in over 3 decades.
30 years. Wow. And that trend is continuing.
Yes. As of early August 2025, the data shows violent crime rates still falling, down 26% compared to the same period last year.
Can you break that down? What kinds of crime?
Sure. Homicides are down 12%.
Yeah.
Sex abuse down a very significant 49%. Assault with a dangerous weapon down 20%. Robbery down 28%.
And property crime.
Also down by 4%. So across the board, the trend lines are pointing downwards quite significantly for violent crime.
So how do you square that circle? The data says things are improving, historically so, but the dominant narrative, especially fueled by specific incidents and political figures, is one of crisis.
That is the central question, isn't it? It highlights this profound disconnect between the perception driving policy and the actual statistical reality, according to D.C.'s own police department and DOJ figures. It's a really tough spot for local officials.
How are D.C.'s local leaders handling this? Mayor Bowser, for instance.
Mayor Muriel Bowser has tried to walk a fine line. She's expressed willingness to cooperate with federal partners, but she's also firmly resisted any talk of a federal takeover.
Pushing back.
Yes, emphasizing the need to preserve local governance, D.C.'s home rule. And she's tried to highlight community-focused initiatives. Back in February 2024, she publicly stated D.C. is a world-class city and pointed out that violent crime was at a 30-year low then. She's trying to counter the narrative with the facts.
But even her own council passed that crime bill we mentioned.
Right, and that bill was explicitly framed as a response to constituent frustration. People being, quote, fed up with the city's crime problems. So even local leaders feel that heat from public perception, regardless of the overall trend lines.
It's also worth reminding people about D.C.'s unique legal setup, isn't it? It's not quite like other cities.
That's a really important point. D.C. operates as a quasi-federal jurisdiction. A key difference is who prosecutes most crimes.
It's not a local DA.
Correct. In D.C., the majority of criminal cases are prosecuted by the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia, which is part of the Federal Department of Justice, not by an elected local district attorney like you have in most major cities.
How does that affect things on the ground?
Well, one consequence is that D.C. criminal cases often involve more court hearings and can stretch out over a longer period compared to similar cases in state courts.
Which sounds potentially inefficient.
It can seem that way, but some argue it actually functions as an important constitutional safeguard. It ensures thorough due process, gives defense attorneys more time to prepare, discuss strategies with clients. It can be vital for ensuring fair outcomes in a complex system.
Okay, so we've got this clear tension. Perception versus data. Federal pressure versus local control. Different approaches emerging. But let's dive a bit deeper into the philosophies behind these approaches. Critics of the tough-on-crime push argue it's not just ineffective, but potentially harmful, right?
Absolutely. There are significant criticisms. Groups like the ACLU, for example, have issued pretty stark warnings about what they see coming, particularly with a second Trump administration.
What are their main concerns?
They warn about a potential return to mass incarceration, about dehumanization in the justice system, even, quote, an unprecedented killing spree through expanded use of the federal death penalty.
Wow, strong language.
Very. They argue that the rhetoric and policies could embolden states to abandon recent reforms and go back to what they call failed crime policies, which they believe fuel mass incarceration and disproportionately harm minority communities, widening racial inequality.
And you mentioned earlier that Trump's relationship with law enforcement itself seems complicated.
It does seem that way. Some observers call it contradictory. For instance, he pardoned over 1,000 people involved in the January 6th Capitol riot.
Including people who assaulted police officers.
Yes, and police unions actually criticized those pardons, saying they endangered their members. Yet, at the same time, he issued that executive order promising things like free legal representation for officers accused of misconduct and increased access to military-grade equipment.
So supporting police in some ways, but undermining them in others, depending on the context.
That's how some critics see it. It's a mixed message, certainly.
There's also the money aspect, funding for local justice initiatives.
Right. This is crucial. Under Trump, the Department of Justice actually cut federal funding for local and state justice programs by an estimated $500 million.
$500 million? What kind of programs are we talking about?
Everything from local policing support and crime prevention initiatives to victim services and juvenile justice programs, things that localities rely on.
And how was that received?
Not well in many quarters. Federal Judge Amit Mehta, who oversees cases related to DOJ funding, called the cuts shameful. And many experts argue that cutting these funds actually undermines the stated goal of fighting violent crime. They say it's likely to increase crime in the long run by weakening local capacity.
So it seems counterintuitive. push for tough enforcement but cut the funding for the very systems needed to do it.
That's the apparent contradiction critics point to.
Okay, so if that's the critique of the tough on crime approach, potential for mass incarceration, racial disparities, questionable effectiveness, funding cuts, what's the alternative philosophy? We hear about community-based approaches addressing root causes.
Exactly. This perspective focuses on investing in what researchers call the social determinants of safety. The idea is that crime doesn't happen in a vacuum.
And there's research backing this up.
Yes, research from places like Brookings Metro is really interesting here. Their analysis suggests that the recent crime reductions we've seen might be linked more to the economic recovery post-pandemic, the return of jobs, educational opportunities reopening.
Less about changes in policing or sentencing laws.
Their research points in that direction. It suggests that focusing only on arrests and punishment might be missing the bigger picture, the underlying factors that contribute to safety or instability in communities.
So what are these key investments, these social determinants?
Well, the research highlights several areas that are seen as powerful, maybe overlooked crime-fighting tools, but many are currently at risk. First, youth development and education.
Like what specifically?
Early childhood programs, access to mental health treatment for young people, summer jobs programs, after-school activities. These things are shown to be really impactful in setting positive trajectories.
But they're at risk.
Yes. For example, there's concern in D.C. about a potential $1 billion cut to youth programming if Congress doesn't pass something called the Local Funds Act. That would be a massive blow.
Okay, what's another key area?
Access to employment and economic stability for adults. Stable jobs, effective workforce development programs, even things like cash assistance programs are strong predictors of community safety.
Makes sense. People with stable incomes are less likely to resort to crime.
Generally, yes. But these are threatened by things like declines in federal employment, which impacts D.C. particular, and cuts to federally funded job training and support services.
Third area.
Housing and community development. Making sure people have stable housing is fundamental.
How does that connect directly to crime?
Research shows that increasing access to affordable housing, providing permanent housing subsidies, and reducing foreclosures are all powerful crime-fighting tools. Stable housing creates stable communities. But again, these are at risk from federal actions that might target housing funds or programs.
Okay. Youth, jobs, housing, what else?
Healthcare, especially preventative public health interventions, access to basic health care, but also critically, substance use treatment and mental health treatment.
The connection there seems pretty clear.
It's strongly linked. Better access is significantly associated with reductions in crime and recidivism. But we're seeing potential federal funding cuts, like a possible $58 million loss for D.C.'s community health centers. And we've even seen pauses in funding or rollouts for things like the 988 mental health crisis line in some areas.
Undermining critical support systems.
Exactly. And one final area often mentioned is access to food and nutrition.
How does food security relate to crime?
Addressing food insecurity, often through programs like SNAP, food stamps, is shown to reduce certain types of crime, particularly nonviolent quality-of-life offenses, often linked to desperation. But proposals to cut SNAP funding could, for instance, leave around 140,000 D.C. residents without adequate food assistance.
It really paints a picture of a complex web of factors influencing safety, doesn't it? Much broader than just policing and prisons.
It really does. And the consensus among many experts in the field, people like Dr. Maria Henderson at George Washington University or Professor James McAllister at the University of Maryland, leans this way.
What's their main message?
They generally caution against relying solely on punitive measures. They advocate for more comprehensive violence prevention strategies, investment in rehabilitation, and strong federal-local partnerships that support local efforts rather than interventions that undermine local autonomy. They argue lasting safety comes from investing in community well-being, not just enforcement.
So wrapping this all up, what's the main takeaway for you from this deep dive? It's a lot to process.
I think the core tension is what really stands out. On one hand, you have this measurable, statistically undeniable improvement in crime rates in places like D.C. and generally nationally after the pandemic spike.
Numbers are clear.
The numbers are pretty clear. But on the other hand, you have this powerful prevailing public perception fueled by media, by politics, by genuinely frightening incidents that crime is out of control.
And that perception is driving a real political pushback towards tough-on-crime policies.
Exactly. It highlights this fundamental debate we're having about what actually makes us safe.
Hmm.
Is it primarily about punitive law enforcement, deterrence, incarceration?
Or is it about investing in those social determinants we just discussed? The building blocks of healthy communities, jobs, education, housing, healthcare. It feels like two very different philosophies about safety and society clashing.
It really does. And as we've laid out the complexities of crime, perception, and policy, it leaves us, and you listening, with a really important question to ponder.
Which is,
When the data tells one story, but public feeling and political rhetoric are driving a completely different narrative, how do we navigate that? How do we, as informed citizens, make sure our communities are pursuing the most effective paths towards real safety and real justice for everyone?
maybe encouraging people to think about what truly makes the city safe and beautiful, to use that phrase from the executive order. Is it just more police patrols and longer sentences?
Or is it ensuring that everyone in the community has a fair shot? Access to a good education, stable work, a safe place to live, the health care they need? What's the foundation of true security?
Something to definitely keep considering as you watch these approaches to crime continue to evolve, not just in D.C., but maybe in your own community too.